Perfect. Oh, okay. So again, welcome. Thank you for being here today. We are talking about disability acceptance in the workplace. And so this is a guide not only to inclusion, but to self-advocacy, which is going to be huge as you're moving into internships and to positions and opportunities in the workplace. So let's talk about self-advocacy and what does that mean? According to the Learning Disabilities Association of America, self-advocacy is knowing what you want, it's knowing what you do well, and it's knowing what you have difficulty doing. It also includes knowing your legal rights and your needs and telling that information to the appropriate person. So we're going to talk a lot about self-advocacy today and how you can how we can facilitate that for you. So what do I mean? What does disability include? The Americans with Disabilities Act defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It can also be a person who has a history or a record of such impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. Now, the ADA does not specifically name all of the impairments that are covered, but that is the definition of disability as defined by the ADA. And an employer is a covered entity. And so the ADA requires covered entities like labor unions, employment contractors, private companies, and state and local governments with 15 or more employees to provide reasonable accommodations to a qualified individual so that they can perform the essential functions of their job. So that is the role of the employer. Now, what would a presentation be without data? If you know me, you know that I love data. So let's talk about what the data says. According to Gamble, some typical barriers to the use of workplace accommodations are lack of knowledge, which is why we're here today to educate you, lack of knowledge and information about workplace accommodations and special technologies, a lack of timeliness in receiving the workplace accommodations. Okay, so now you are able to get workplace accommodations, but now it's taking a long time to implement them. That can be a barrier. Inadequate evaluation procedures, as well as the absence of collaboration. And we'll talk about your role in that collaborative piece in a minute. In 2017, a report by the Center for Talent Innovation, they researched with a think tank and advisory group working for the advancement of underrepresented groups, and they found that among college-educated employees in white-collar work environments, 30% of the employees worked with some form of disability, 30%. Now, surprisingly, only 3.2 of these employees chose to disclose their disabilities to their employers. So that's a lot. And a lot of people who are not able to advocate for themselves or who are choosing not to advocate for themselves in the workplace. In a separate American study of 132 college graduates with learning disabilities at a large public competitive post-secondary institution, 46% reported that they don't self-disclose because of fear of a potentially negative impact in the workplace or due to a concern for job security. So again, today is talking about all of those things and how employers must work with you in terms of ADA and accommodations. So here's a rundown of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA helps people with disabilities across the same access the same employment opportunities and benefits available to people without disabilities. It applies to employers with 15 or more employees. And it also requires those employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified applicants and employees. So we're going to talk about that distinction in a minute. A reasonable accommodation is a change that accommodates employees with disabilities so they can do the job without causing the employer undue hardship, which is defined on the next slide as too much difficulty or too much expense. And the ADA defines disability, establishes guidelines for the reasonable accommodation process, and outlines guidelines for those processes. So let's talk about undue hardship. Now, a determination of undue hardship is based on several factors. So this includes the nature and the cost of the accommodation needed, the overall financial resources of the facility making the reasonable accommodation. So that includes the number of people employed at the facility and the effect on expenses and resources of the facility. Also, the type of operation of the employer, including the structure and functions of the workforce, the geographic separateness, and the administrative or fiscal relationship of the facility involved in making the accommodations, and then the impact of the accommodation on the operation of the facility. So the ADA's legislative history indicates that Congress wanted employers to consider all possible sources of outside funding when assessing whether a particular accommodation would be too costly. Undue hardship is determined based on the net cost to the employer. So an employer should determine whether funding is available from an outside source, like a state rehab agency or some other form to pay for all or part of the accommodation. And in addition, the employer should determine whether it's eligible for certain tax credits or deductions to offset the cost of the accommodation. And then to the extent that a portion of the cost of accommodation would cause undue hardship, the employer can ask the individual with the disability if he or she will pay the difference. Again, if that is a undue hardship to the employer. And if the employer determines that one particularly reasonable accommodation will cause undue hardship, but a second type will be effective and will not cause the undue hardship, then the employer has to provide the second accommodation. So if undue hardship is present, it's really up to the employer to find a reasonable accommodation that doesn't provide undue hardship. Now, according to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, there are 3 types of job modifications or adjustments that can be made. The first is a modification or adjustment to a job application process that enables a qualified applicant with a disability to be considered for the position they desire. So in applying for jobs, you can also ask for modifications or adjustments for the actual application process itself. It also includes modifications or adjustments to the work environment that enable a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of that position. And then finally, it includes modifications or adjustments that enable a covered entity's employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment as are enjoyed by its other similarly situated employees without disabilities. According to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, these barriers may be physical obstacles like inaccessible facilities or inaccessible equipment, or they might be procedures or rules like rules concerning when work is performed or when breaks are taken or how essential functions are performed. And reasonable accommodation removes those barriers for the individuals with disabilities. So for example, a cleaning company, let's take a cleaning company for instance, they rotate their staff to different floors on a monthly basis. One crew member has a psychiatric disability. While his mental illness does not affect his ability to perform the cleaning functions, it does make it difficult to adjust to the alterations in the routine. So the employee has had a significantly difficult time adjusting to the monthly changes in the floor assignments. He asks for a reasonable accommodation and proposes 3 options. See, this is where collaboration comes in. So you can go to your employer with options, and that's perfectly acceptable. His options were staying on one floor permanently, staying on one floor for 2 months and then rotating, or allowing a transition period to adjust to the change in floor assignments. These accommodations are all reasonable because they appear to be feasible solutions to the employee's problem dealing with changes to his routine. And they also appear to be effective because they would allow him to perform his cleaning duties. So see how reasonable accommodations do not cause undue hardship, but they may be an alteration to the functions of the job. So for types of reasonable accommodations in the hiring process, an employer can tell applicants what the hiring process involves. So an interview, a timed written test, which I know has come up in some situations, or a job demonstration, and it can ask applicants whether they will need a reasonable accommodation for this process or not. So for the process itself. Now, they may not ask about reasonable accommodations for the job until after a conditional offer is made, but they can ask if there's reasonable accommodations that need to be made for the application process. An employer must provide a reasonable accommodation to a qualified applicant with a disability that will enable the individual to have an equal opportunity to participate in the application process and to be considered for a job unless it can show undue hardship. So individuals with disabilities who meet the initial requirements to be considered for a job should not be excluded from the application process because the employer speculates or feels like, based on a request for a reasonable accommodation, that they will be unable to provide the individual with the accommodation to perform the job. So even if they feel like they may not be able to accommodate the individual on the job, that doesn't mean that they get to not give them accommodations during the hiring process. And an employer may switch the marginal functions of 2 or more employees in order to restructure a job as a reasonable accommodation. So for example, let's go back to that cleaning crew. A cleaning crew works in an office building, and one member of the crew wears a prosthetic leg, which enables him to walk very well, but climbing steps can be painful and difficult. Although he can perform his essential functions without problems, he cannot perform the marginal function of sweeping the steps located throughout the building. The marginal functions of a second crew member include cleaning a small kitchen in the employees' lounge, which is something that both crew members can perform. So the employer can switch the functions of these 2 employees so that the person with the prosthetic leg is able to clean the kitchen and the other employee is able to sweep the steps. So everybody has access. When we talk about leave, permitting the use of accrued paid leave or unpaid leave is a form of reasonable accommodation when necessitated by an employee's disability. So the employer does not have to provide paid leave beyond that which would be provided to similarly situated employees. But the employer should allow the employee to exhaust all paid leave before taking unpaid leave. So you're allowed to take all of your paid leave before you become unpaid. And if an equivalent position is not available upon return, then the employer must look for a vacant position at a lower level. Types of reasonable accommodations on the job. No undue hardship to the employer must be present, and this is key. A modified schedule may involve adjusting arrival or departure times, providing periodic breaks, altering when certain functions are performed, allowing an employee to use accrued paid leave, or providing additional unpaid leave. An employer must provide a modified or part-time schedule when required as a reasonable accommodation unless it creates undue hardship, even if it does not provide that schedule to other employees. And if modifying an employee's schedule does pose undue hardship, then an employer has to consider reassignment to a vacant position that would enable the employee to work during the hours requested. So if you're unable in the current position to change your hours based on what your disability requires or your medical needs require, then the employer has to look for a position at a lower level or for a vacant position that would enable you to work the hours requested if it's disability based. Modified workplace policies can be applied to the employee with a disability without having to alter the policy for another employee. So for example, if there's a strict no eating policy at your desk, but you are diabetic and you require food at a certain time, the employer has to allow it for you, but they can keep the company policy that there's no eating at the desk, even though they allow that in your situation. So how do we ask for accommodations? Well, an individual with a disability may request a reasonable accommodation at any time during the application process or at any time during the period of employment. The ADA does not limit an employee with a disability from requesting a reasonable accommodation because he or she did not ask for one when applying for the job or after receiving a job offer. but an individual with a disability should request a reasonable accommodation when they know that a workplace barrier will prevent him or her, due to the disability, from effectively competing for a position, performing a job, or gaining equal access to the benefit of employment. And it is in your best interest to request a reasonable accommodation before your performance suffers or before conduct problems occur. When the disability or the need for accommodations is not obvious, the employer may ask the individual for reasonable documentation about his or her disability and functional limitations. So if your disability is what we call an invisible disability, it's not apparent just by the physicality, then the employer is able to ask for reasonable documentation, including the disability and the functional limitations. And the employer is entitled to know that the individual has a covered disability for which he or she needs reasonable accommodation. In order to ask for accommodations, you should have a clear description of your disability, of the accommodations that you need, and of the modifications needed in the work environment to ensure that you successfully perform your job tasks. The ADA does allow employers to legally turn down accommodation requests if they can prove undue hardship. So sometimes they may offer alternatives that would result in the same outcome, but for these reasons, it's important that you suggest appropriate accommodations as well. And again, that's where that collaboration piece comes in. You want a say in what barriers you see to being able to perform your job functions and to what accommodations can mitigate those barriers. So come with suggestions as well. Employers are really open to suggestions typically. You also want to make the request brief. Include relevant information about your disability and the need for accommodations, and then explain how the accommodations will help you meet work goals or meet the company goals or do better at the job itself. And then if your request is denied, the next step is to work with a higher level of authority like HR or a union rep, or to file a written complaint under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So here are some examples. The first example, I'm having trouble getting to work at my scheduled start time because of medical treatments I'm undergoing. This is actually a request for a reasonable accommodation. So the person is having trouble getting into work, they're undergoing medical treatment, the employer would have to find an alternative for them. The second one says, an employee tells his supervisor, I need 6 weeks off to get treatment for a back problem. This is a request for a reasonable accommodation. Again, the employee would need to exhaust paid leave and then be eligible for unpaid leave, but they would be eligible for that 6 weeks off for treatment for a back problem. Third example says, a new employee who uses a wheelchair informs the employer that her wheelchair cannot fit under the desk in her office. This is a request for a reasonable accommodation. Again, it's directly tied to a disability, and the employer would have to be able to find an alternative desk that would accommodate a wheelchair. And then finally, an employee tells his supervisor that he would like a new chair because his present one is uncomfortable. Although this is a request for a change at work, his statement is not sufficient to put the employer on notice that he's requesting a reasonable accommodation. So he doesn't link his need for the new chair to a medical condition, so that would not actually be covered under ADA. Now, when talking about ADA and about inclusion and accommodations in the workplace, we want to come at it from a lens of allyship. Whether you have a disability or not, the lens of allyship is going to really help facilitate inclusion in the workplace. So according to the National Association of City and County Health Officials, a person with a disability defined an ally as someone who supports the cause of a marginalized group, like women, people of color, people with disabilities, people with low income, and they use their privilege to learn from that group and amplify their cause. So there's a picture on here from the Center for Disease Control. I'm going to read it to you for those of you that need that assistance. The A, and so it has ally going down the left-hand side, and then each letter stands for something. And so the A in ally stands for acknowledging and respecting individual experiences and abilities. The first L stands for learning about different disability types. Not all disabilities are the same. Not all disabilities have the same functional limitations. So learning about different disability types is crucial. The second L is leverage. Leverage your influence to promote accessibility and inclusion. You may have a bigger sphere of influence than somebody else, so you want to be able to leverage that to facilitate inclusion for all. And finally, the Y yields the floor to people with disabilities to help identify and eliminate barriers. This means, yes, using your privilege to leverage inclusion, but also giving people with disabilities the floor to be able to talk about their own experiences and their own barriers to employment as they see in regards to their disability. When we're talking about inclusive practices in presentations, there are several ways that you can be inclusive in presentations that you give. The main one, or some main ones, include having printed copies of the slides and having them enlarged. Providing an audio transcript. This is super important for somebody who maybe has processing deficits or who is visually impaired, who needs to go back and listen to the audio of the presentation. Providing closed captioning is important, as we've done today. And then this is something that I didn't consider in the beginning until I got more into the world of disability, was considering fonts, illustrations, and colors. This is really important because there are certain disabilities that that require the brain to see fonts in a certain way or to see colors in a certain way. So if you have, for instance, a black background with a bright colored font, there are certain types of disabilities that don't allow people to read what that says. It's going to be very difficult for them to read it. Same thing with fonts. There are certain cognitive disabilities, dyslexia is one of them, where if you're reading in a really curly or scripty font, it's much harder to read than if it's in a plain font like Times or sans serif. And then illustrations as well. You'll notice that my presentation does not have many illustrations, and that's because people with visual processing difficulties see the illustrations and it takes away from the words, and they have a hard time discriminating between important information on the slides. So we want to make sure that everything that is on a slide is pertinent to the presentation. And then you want to describe visual information. So if you are in a lecture hall, for instance, and you were to ask a question, you would want to describe how many people raised their hands. Oh, I see 10 hands raised. Okay, let's start with the first person, you in the back, so that somebody who has a visual impairment is able to get a sense for what the entire experience is like. So a good rule of thumb is to assume that your audience cannot see well or at all, hear well or at all, move well or at all, speak well or at all, or understand information presented in some ways well or at all. So after you create a presentation, you can go through these different steps and see if your presentation applies to these rules. So if you are assuming that your audience cannot see well at all, then that means that you're describing everything that's on the slide. If they can't hear well at all, then you're having captions and so on and so forth. I am a very fast speaker, but I'm trying to slow down in this presentation, especially, and when I work with students to facilitate understanding. If somebody has a slow processing speed or just isn't feeling well that day or whatever the case may be, we want to facilitate time to process, allowing people to process and being comfortable with silence as well. And finally, you want to just ask people, about the preferred language. Some people say, I have autism, while others say, I am autistic. And it's a very small but very significant distinction between the two. So you want to talk to people about their preferred language. You want to ask if assistance is needed. Don't just assume. What I'm giving today is a lot of general information, but you want to really create those relationships and get to know the individuals so that you know how to best advocate with them, be an ally with them, and support them in the workplace. And one fantastic resource that I have found in my research is called the Job Accommodation Network. Now, I have an Aunt Jan, and she thought that askjan.org was the most fantastic thing. So that's an easy way to remember the website, askjan.org. And it's the leading source of free, expert, and confidential guidance on job accommodations and disability employment issues. So it serves customers across the US and around the world and has been doing so for more than 35 years. Jan provides free one-to-one practical guidance and technical assistance on job accommodation solutions, Title I of the ADA, which is the employment section, and related legislation and self-employment and entrepreneurship options for people with disabilities. There's a one-on-one practical guidance section in askjan.org, as well as an ADA library. So you can look up snippets of the ADA without having to read the entire document. There's an A to Z listing of accommodations in the workplace. And then there's a search for accommodations where you can put in what you think is needed, and it will show you kind of a more generic accommodation that matches what you need. Okay. So this is a fantastic resource. I would definitely recommend going here if you have any questions, or going to the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act documents. I also have references, which when we record this, when we put it up on the website, hopefully you'll be able to see those references to some of the websites and articles that I've cited today. And then if you have any questions, now is the time to ask questions. We also have a survey here. And so this survey is helpful, not only because it's Autism Acceptance Month, but it's also helpful to letting us know what you may want to see in the future, what we can collaborate on, and how we may change this in the future to help facilitate more inclusivity. Okay, my contact information is also below, as is the access email, which goes to Dean Amy and myself. And now's the time for questions if you need any, if you would like to ask any.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. I'll stop the recording now and open it up for questions.